Anim, bienvenue and welcome everybody to today's webinar on environmental racism in your backyard. Today's session is a part one of two series, and it's my pleasure to be able to host both of them. My name is Farah and I'm a member of the webinar team and a grade 7-8 teacher in the Toronto District School Board. Thanks very much to each and every one of you for being here today and for joining us in this learning series offered in partnership by the Toronto District School Board and OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. So I'd like to begin by extending a warm welcome to Hilary Inwood, lead of environmental sustainability, and she's there at OISE, as well as members of the Sustainability and Climate Action Network, SCAN, Sarah Urquhart and Elise Kennedy. Welcome. I'd also like to give another warm welcome to the Toronto District School Board's Eco Schools and Sustainability Office team. They partner with OISE, as mentioned earlier, on so many incredible events. Welcome to David Hawker-Budlowski, the Central Coordinating Principal, Outdoor Education, and Chris Metropolis, the Eco Schools Certification Specialist, and to so many of you from TOES, the Toronto Outdoor Education School. Thank you all so very much for being here, and to all of you in our audience in attendance for today's part one session, Environmental Racism in Your Backyard. And if you're just entering now, if you've joined us late, please do the entry poll or complete the entry poll on the screen just to let us know a little bit about yourself. We'll begin today with our land acknowledgement before we hear from our wonderful guest speakers, Sylvia, Denton, Carryl, and Aleeya Ali. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speakers, and we'll tell you a bit more about them as we get underway. Following our guest speakers, we will be sharing some resources with you, as well as information about some upcoming webinars that you may be interested in attending. So we have been featuring the work of Indigenous artists along with the land acknowledgement at the start of our webinar series. Today, we'd like to feature the beautiful work of Casey Adams. Casey Adams is a Cree Ojibwe and British artist and educator based in Winnipeg. She's a multimedia artist who is known for creating artwork that draws inspiration from popular culture and science fiction to deal with contemporary social issues. Her work addresses racism, colonization, human impact on land, and the challenges and perceptions of Indigenous people. In this perception photo series, Casey Adams confronts common stereotypes of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people to illustrate a more contemporary, truthful story that challenges the culture of apathy and willful ignorance about Indigenous issues. We acknowledge that we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And while this is the TDSB's land acknowledgement, we recognize that a land acknowledgement alone is not enough. It's just a starting point for all of us. And it's a reminder that there's still a lot of work to be done, and that we have to enact and take action towards decolonization and reconciliation. With that being said, it's my pleasure to welcome our guest speakers for today. Sylvia Denton Carryl is the Outdoor Learning Coordinator for the Toronto District School Board. And in this new initiative, she provides leadership and support to a team of outdoor education teachers as they work to engage school communities in outdoor learning within their local green space. Prior to this new role, Sylvia has worked as an outdoor education teacher and site supervisor. She is passionate about using the outdoors as a third teacher and firmly believes that students from diverse backgrounds should see themselves reflected and experience the outdoors as welcoming spaces. Our second guest speaker today is Aleeya Ali. She is a TDSB teacher who has spent most of the last 18 years teaching intermediate science and math. She enjoys incorporating outdoor education into her teaching all year round, and she and her students can be found hunting for fractals or icicles on beaches and local green spaces each winter. That sounds really fun and engaging. We really look forward to hearing and learning from both of you, Sylvia and Aleeya, And with that, I'm turning it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. So happy to be here, that you're spending an hour with us and to engage in the learning as it relates to environmental racism. I'm going to share my screen, so just give me a moment. Okay. All right, excellent. Okay, so environmental racism in your backyard. So what is it? How does it impact our teaching? How does it shape the lens at which we look at the curriculum and how we engage in students in the outdoors? How do we allow communities to share and invite communities to share the way that they've used activism to navigate environmental racism? How do we empower communities? All of those things are things that we're going to be discussing in deep and meaningful ways. And hopefully you'll be able to take away those things as well and embed them in your practice and be able to use them. So our goals for this session: to define environmental racism. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll discuss different forms of environmental racism. There's numerous within Canada. Yes, here in Canada too. And so we'll discuss a couple of case studies and look at what that looks like for different communities. And then we're going to hopefully through that position you to really think about what is the impact of environmental racism and how can we really create environments where we are challenging students to advocate and to create change? And what does that look like in your classroom setting? And then also shine a light on activism and the critical work that is happening in communities to change the narrative and to really look at what are those grassroots organizations and what does that look like and what are youth doing to change the narrative, specifically Black, Indigenous, and racialized individuals. And throughout this presentation, you will see that that is the theme, centering their stories, but also centering their success and centering the empowerment within those communities. I'm a firm believer that when we speak about communities and different forms of oppression, that it does not sit in that space. We all need to learn about the oppression, right? And we all need to learn about power structures and dynamics, but it's very important that as educators, as humans, as citizens of our world, that it does not sit in that space and it doesn't sit in the space of how oppression is being done to communities that are racialized and marginalized, but it sits also in a space of empowerment. And what is the resilience and what is the power within these communities? And that is going to be the space that we sit in today as well, and to really celebrate the humanity within these communities. So I have a question for you. What is environmental racism? So I'm going to put that up. And if you could answer in the chat, what do you think it is? So if you could respond in the chat, what do you think it is? When you hear environmental racism, what comes to mind? Leah, maybe you could read out some of the chat responses since I'm floating between screens.
I cannot see nothing in the chat just yet. Oh, here we go. Marion Shank says where factories are located. Yes, that's a really great start. Maria Mar says the yards where Haitian refugees that I taught lived, which flooded regularly. Yeah, absolutely. Different access to land. Denise says unequal access to parks and tree canopy. Absolutely. Nancy Gillis says access to green spaces, affordable homes on unsafe land, include and exclude everyone in nature. Absolutely. Jessica says the disproportionate amount of pollution and environmental destruction that is borne by people of color. Perceptions about who gets to go camping. Absolutely. Shipping of toxic waste to developing countries. Yes, because we don't want that in our backyard.
Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing.
Everyone.
Thank you everyone for sharing those comments. And as you think about the comments and continue to put them in the chat, and hopefully everyone will also take a look at them. I'm just going to show you a collage of environmental racism. So some of these ideas and these concepts came up when I asked what is it, and it came up in the comments. And so as you're thinking about that, in our work, do we actively provide experiences and learning opportunities to understand and really think about all the ways that environmental racism impacts the students who are in front of us? Or do we perpetuate forms of environmental racism, stereotypes, and misconceptions? So I hope that that's going to be a question that sits with you. Do we provide experiences and learning opportunities to understand and to really understand the issues around environmental racism? and how it impacts our students, or do we perpetuate? And that's something that's so key. How we might be perpetuating environmental racism, stereotypes, and misconceptions. Intentionally or unintentionally, doesn't matter, it's the impact, right? And I have a whole issue around intentionality, which I won't go into in this session. Maybe that'll be a part 3 somewhere else. But what does that look like in our practice? And that's a hard question, but it's one worth asking, reflecting on, and being determined to change. We know that there are many ways to think about environmental racism. And for the people who this is their lived experience, there are multiple ways in which they experience the impact of environmental racism every single day. So for some people, they get to read about it. And for some people, this is their life. This is what they wake up to every single day. So I want to share with you a definition from Dr. Waldron, her work is phenomenal. She is a social scientist and she's an associate professor at Dalhousie University. She's also the founder and the director of an Enrich project. I encourage you to read and learn more about her because her work is tremendous. And she has lots of webcasts and webinars and different things that really helps to shine light on the issues around environmental racism. So she says that she defines environmental racism as the disproportionate location or sit-in of polluted industries and communities of color, Indigenous communities, Black communities, and the working poor. She adds that these are typically communities that lack an economic and political base to fight back. And I would like to add that a lot of times these communities are fighting back and are advocating, but the people who hold the power or the gatekeepers are not listening. So they fight, but who is listening? And I think that's an important question. When people are advocating, when communities are advocating, how are they being heard? How are their concerns being addressed? I also really appreciated the definition of Dr. John Francis. And Dr. John Francis is an environmentalist, and I encourage you to read up more about him as well. But I like the way how he tied in the environment, because so many times we think we have different opinions of what environmental racism is. But to me, and in my understanding, it's anything that happens in the environment as it connects to racism is environmental racism. And those who live in bodies that experience racism often, they will tell you that it is exactly that. And so his definition of environmental racism, for me, the environment changed from being just about pollution, endangered species, and climate change. So for some people, it stops right there. But that's a very privileged definition of environmental racism. And if that's the only part you're experiencing, that I would consider that to be a very privileged way to experience it. But for other people, it is about human rights, civil rights, economic equity, gender equality, and all the ways we relate to each other. That's what environment is. It has to be everything. So we have an understanding or working understanding of what environmental racism is. So I wanted to share a little bit about 2 case studies that we're going to be discussing. So the first one is about Africville. And many of you may have heard about the story of Africville. But I'm also going to share about the joy, the humanity, and the strength and the advocacy of a community. I'm going to share about the resistance. I'm going to share about the survival. I'm going to share about the power and the way the community came together. I'm going to share that human part of Africville. And so Africville, is a place that is, it's in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and many Black loyalists settled there. Interesting fun fact, many Maroons were sent there from the Caribbean. And so it had a very large Black population, very close-knit community. They would help each other. So if someone wanted to build a house, somebody was a bricklayer, somebody knew how to put up walls, people were always helping, right? Helping to put together their homes on the plot of land that they owned. Everyone, it was like a family. So it didn't matter that you were just friends, everyone just worked together as a community. And all the homes there were built by the community. And so just think about that joy and that pride, putting your hands to something, starting it and bringing it to fruition, that joy and that pride that you feel in your community and as a network of being able to problem solve and work through that. The church that you see in this picture was a focal point of Africville, and it was a place where community would come together. They would share their joys, families, families would raise their young ones together. It would be a place to connect with each other, to talk about politics or social issues, you name it. But for Black communities, for many Black communities, the church was that hub, that place of coming together, that place of being united about common causes, or just that place to rest and feed your soul. And so that's what the church was for Africville. When we think about entertainers, if they came to Nova Scotia, many entertainers could not sit at a restaurant and enjoy a meal because of the racism in Nova Scotia. So yes, racism in Canada existed in spaces that people could not sit down and enjoy a meal. And so for those entertainers that came and couldn't sit and enjoy a meal, they would be, the community would welcome them into their homes and welcome them to have a meal and to join together, and that would turn into like a concert and people singing and enjoying each other's company. This was Africville, people coming together, people being united, people helping one another, and really pulling together and celebrating their traditions and their culture and their way of being. The other part of Africville is what the city, what the government did. Right. So these were the Africville, the community, would they pay their taxes. They did all the things that we're supposed to do to be a good citizen, paid their taxes, went to school, worked, did all those things to be contributing members of society. But still, the government decided that, you know what, we are not going to give them the services that they rightly deserve and that they should have. And it became a dumping ground of all kinds of different things and issues that they didn't want to place into other communities. So let me just flip the slide so we can talk a little bit about that. And so instead of like in other communities where, you know, they pay their tax and they don't get what they needed, the city refused to provide them with amenities such as proper sewage. And so there was an open sewage pipe, access to clean water. They had to boil their water. Wells, issues with garbage disposal. There was an infectious disease hospital. So all kinds of things. And then there was a train track. Of course, they decided to put a train track in the middle of the community. So when children needed to cross over to the other side, they now have to be crossing over a train track. And so all these things were done to the community. And in the end, when, you know, they decided that the government decided that Africville should no longer exist, then they decided that they wanted to relocate the community elsewhere. And what that meant for this community that was deeply connected was that they either were asked, first they were asked, first they were asked to go. The ones that said, no, I'm not going, this is home, this is my safe haven. Then they were threatened, they were bribed, and if they refused to go, the contents of their homes were removed by bulldozers, and their home would just be carried away in a dump truck. And so imagine the impact of that has. So even if you're the neighbor that says, I'm not going, you see your neighbor beside you, their house being demolished, right? There are community members from Africville that say they remember the day that the church is their hub, that place where the community comes together and build relationships. They remembered when the church was destroyed. So imagine what this does to a community that was so deeply connected, and all of those things were removed, and they were told to relocate and given $500. So after these people have already built their home and established themselves, given $500 to relocate. And what that devastation did to communities and what it did specifically to this Black community. So I mentioned this about the dump, about the human waste, about the hospital infectious disease, and how it was all located in the surrounding areas where people worked and went to school, and about the railway. And I want to really highlight the fact that the people protested. They protested, they petitioned, they argued about why this is not right. They advocated in so many ways. And I want to also share that that advocacy continues till now, because there have been numerous civil lawsuits that have been filed still, and the government is still not taking responsibility all these years later. So when we think about power dynamics and structures, racist structures that are in place, that is clear evidence of something that is still in place until today, that they're still fighting for and fighting for justice, and fighting, for people to understand what was done to them. So that really speaks to their strength and to their resilience. And so despite all of these circumstances, the community still They still tried to work and build and come together. And even when they were relocated, as many of them that could come together or were close enough, they still tried to connect. And there were still opportunities that they tried to create within their community to return to Africville after they had destroyed it. So really focusing on what that community was and the environmental racism that took place to try to not only to ruin and to ruin their pride and their community, but also to destroy their spirit. And so, you know, thinking about that and how, you know, when we advocate, sometimes our resolve can be lessened because we're constantly advocating what that does to a community when they're positioned in that way. So Leah will now talk about the next case study.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. That's a really hard act to follow. I'm going to talk briefly about the Aamjiwnaang people in the Sarnia area. The Aamjiwnaang people have been situated on their land for hundreds of years, and through various treaties, their land has been ceded to in various parcels and various times, and where they are situated now is a fraction, of course, of what they started with. The treaty that assigned their land where it is now was signed in 1827, and in the later 1800s, oil was discovered not far away from this area, and the exploration and the exploitation and the use of this land for oil processing started from the late 1800s and has created an area that is just a disaster now. And this is where people live, and this is the land that they have been on for hundreds of years. So currently, the Aamjiwnaang First Nation Reserve is home to about 850 Chippewa people. It's surrounded by about, I think the last check was 63 petroleum refineries. There are a lot of hydrogen sulfide spills that often go unreported. And what happens is it's actually the Aamjiwnaang people who will report to Health Canada that there's been a spill, we can smell the air, and they'll say, well, what wind direction is it coming from? And so they're actually relying on these people to report smells, spills, and when the offending companies do not report the spills, and we have children from schools and daycares going to the hospital, because the spills aren't reported, the children are misdiagnosed and mistreated because they say, well, there's no spill, so therefore, you know, this illness, these swollen bleeding eyes that your children are experiencing are not what you think it is. It's something else. And so the children are not being treated at the hospital appropriately because oftentimes spills go unreported. So what in learning about all of this, you know, and hearing people from the community speak what they really want, no one's asking for different land. No one's asking the petroleum companies to leave. They understand, you know, they are looking to coexist. And so what mothers of children and families are asking for is they want these petroleum companies to be using the best, the most modern, the most expensive, the absolute best technology that there is to be had to keep the air and the water safe, and to put in every possible option to keep the community safe. And what the petroleum companies are saying is, no, we can't do that. It's too expensive. The result is that the toxic load per person, and this data is, I would say it's at least 10 years old. The toxic load is approximately 1,800 kilograms per person per year. This is in the air they breathe. This is in their soil. This is in their water. And as you can expect, the percentage of cancer, of illness in the community is far higher than it is in communities that are not located near petrochemical environments, and there are measures that can be taken to reduce this impact, and the petro companies are saying, no, we can't do that. A quick Google search will bring up many articles about the impact. At this point, the birth sex ratio of girls to boys is roughly 67% of new babies born are female and 33% are male. So this is affecting an entire generation. It's affecting people's health, and it is affecting future generations. So the gender ratio is about 2 to 1 for girls. And while I can't give you any specific First Nation communities where this is also happening, I know that this is a theme that is happening throughout many First Nation reserves for the same reasons. Now, before we get into breakout rooms, I'm going to really briefly talk about criticality. Now, Dr. Goldie Muhammad, in her book Cultivating Genius, defines criticality as it's like 1 step or 2 steps beyond critical thinking. And in criticality, it is the capacity to read, write, and think in ways of understanding power, privilege, and social justice and oppression, particularly for populations who have been historically marginalized in the world. And just to give you an example of this power and privilege, the fine for dumping on Crown land here in Canada is $1,000 to $2,000. The fine for dumping on First Nation reserves will not exceed $100. Criticality means that you can see the power, the privilege, and the oppression that these type of laws present. Thinking with criticality recognizes the oppression that this creates. And so this brings us to our breakout room session. What I'm going to do is, I think the breakout rooms will be created. And in the chat, I'm going to drop the links to the 2 decks. Well, 2 decks, we've already seen the slides. One case study is going to deal with Africville. And so one deck is going to have those slides and guiding questions for your discussion. And the second set is going to have the slides from the Chemical Valley case study with the same guiding questions for you to discuss in your group. So there are the 2, and I just said odd number breakout rooms can do case study 1, even numbered breakout rooms can look at case study 2. We'll have, I think we have about 8 minutes. I'm not 100% sure on the timing. Hillary, you can advise.
Maybe 10.
Maybe 10, okay.
Yeah, maybe 10.
And we're just looking for you to discuss some of the leading questions to see, you know, when you learn about this, how do you take this to your classroom? What does this look like on the ground? What does the work that you're doing look like?
And really, really just centering the criticality and the understanding of the power structures and the power dynamics, centering that in the conversations that you're having amongst yourselves.
So we are ready for breakout rooms. Oh, awesome. Hopefully not too many people got cut off by that. Yeah. I know we were like, we got 6 seconds, go, keep going, keep going. Are there any highlights from your, now we have a relatively large group. Does anybody want to throw in the chat some of the highlights of your conversation, some of the great things you were talking about? If you can either throw it into the chat or mic up and.
So we only have a couple of minutes to talk about it, but if you don't feel comfortable to turn on your mic, then please put it in the chat. And as you're putting together your thoughts, I also wanted to share that some of the resources that we shared here was from literacy, from the English and Literacy Department, the Show Me series. So if you have not gone through their site to look at through resources, they have phenomenal resources. I'll actually put in the chat. So we want to recognize the contribution of how that resources also shaped our knowledge, especially around criticality. So I'll put that in the chat. Anybody want to quickly share?
I'm seeing a lot of people mention the book and the documentary, There's Something in the Water. And yes, that's really, really fantastic. I actually just showed that to my students this week to finish up history and jump into geography and our water unit in science. It's been pretty fantastic at that.
How did you access it?
I borrowed it from the library, which I may get into trouble for saying that, because I watched it from Netflix at home, but we can't show that at school. So I went through the library.
All right. And I also wanted to just share the importance of, so when I share the story of Africville and share the humanity and the way community came together, that when we're speaking to students about different issues around social justice, around racism, around oppression, equity, that is really important that we layer the resources, layer the text, so that students don't walk away with saying like, oh, all Black people do this. Oh, all of Africa was that. And so we don't end up with these single stories. And, there's a webinar, The Danger of a Single Story, a TED broadcast about that. And, it's so important that we're layering resources, layering text, layering different experiences so that children leave with a wholesome understanding. And that, as I said at the beginning, that we center resistance, empowerment, advocacy, and all of that. So that no community, no student in your class feels like this was done to my community and I am powerless.
Yep.
After whatever it is that you're teaching, no child should be left feeling like that. So, really centering it on that empowerment. And as I said, as layering text and how important that is. And building your own capacity, right? So if there's something that you're not sure about, really work to build your capacity, and so that you're going into it with that knowledge base, so that harm is not done. That is really, really important to communities that are racialized, that are marginalized, and to Indigenous communities, that harm is not done. I think I saw a hand.
Yeah, that was my hand. So my group, our conversation was just about how to facilitate conversations. So we spoke about, the resources that are used in your classroom, what teachers use, and the different kind of curriculum that's used, resources that you choose, the budget that the administrators give you for the curriculum leaders to purchase those resources, and making sure they're culturally responsive. And they're actually purchasing, resources, for example, from bookstores that support, what we're doing. Also using, the leaders in your building, your curriculum leaders, department heads, school councils, parent council. So on the school council at my school, for example, there's it's called NEATS, and Environmental Action Team for Northview. And they're aligning, for example, with the Black Student Alliance. So getting different clubs and councils together to come up with ideas. And yeah, those are some ways that we talked about facilitating conversations.
Thank you. Did anybody else? And please keep an eye on the chat as well, so that as other ideas that people came up with in the groups, that you're taking that in as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about environmental justice. So we talked about environmental racism. And when we understand environmental racism, it gives us the tools to navigate and work towards environmental justice in a meaningful way. So if spaces, I just want us to think about this for a minute. If spaces are prohibitive towards racialized groups and people, and if they still don't feel like they have access, then they won't be able to take up that space, and they won't be able to feel welcomed in those spaces. And so environmental justice is not about the dominant culture announced into Black, racialized, and Indigenous communities, about their interpretation of environmental justice. It's not about that. It is about working alongside with community and truly listening to the needs and the barriers and solutions that come out of those conversations. And I think that's so key, right? It's not about what we think, being the dominant group, what the dominant group thinks is environmental justice. It's about the people who it impacts the most, listening to what their concerns and their needs are and centering that. And environmental justice focuses on tools and the strategies to address environmental racism. And an in-depth understanding of environmental racism and the needs and concerns of these communities needs to be understood when we are addressing environmental racism. And, you know, last week, the Toronto Public Library had a panel discussion with Ingrid Waldron, another individual named Chuck, Demisha Dennis, and one other individual. And Dr. Waldron sums it up so beautifully here. And I'm going to play this clip of what her definition of environmental justice is.
Thank you. And Dr. Waldron, that question to you as well. Do you think it's more of a social, is it a social justice movement?
It thinks it is. I mean, my answer to that is the people who are in the environmental justice movement think they're in a social justice movement, but it's not. It was conceived as a social justice movement back in 1991 when a whole group of people gathered in Washington, D.C. These were primarily BIPOC people who were writing 17 principles of what environmental justice was. It was conceived as a BIPOC movement. And over time, I think the environmental movement has been hijacked by white people who are more concerned about wildlife conservation. All these things are important. So I'm not saying they're not important, but it's been hijacked by white people who have more concerns about wildlife conservation than people, than human beings, by the bodies of Black people and Indigenous people. So to me, until race is centered in that movement, I mean, those of us who are doing this work on race, we know what it is, but we know more broadly in Canada that race has been absent from much of the discussion on the environmental movement. So race must be put back in. Race must be centered, but we also need an intersectional approach, because we know that when we look at environmental justice or the environmental movement, for it to be a social justice movement, it must look at race and how it intersects with socioeconomic status and class and all these other factors. So certainly the people involved in it, most of whom are white, think it's a social justice movement, but in my opinion, it isn't. So I think as Black people and as BIPOC people, we need to take it back.
Definitely. I'm over here snapping.
So I encourage you to also listen to the rest of that webinar with the panelists, because it speaks to the tools, it speaks to what it is, it speaks to all of those capacities, and it speaks to some of the difficult things that makes people uncomfortable. But in work around anti-oppression and equity, there's going to be discomfort, right? And as we tackle environmental justice and the racism piece of it, people will be uncomfortable, but that's okay, because when you're uncomfortable, that's what creates shifts and changes, and there are communities that are dependent on that, on their outcome to change, on the outcome to change. So I always say not to sit in the discomfort, but to move through the discomfort and challenge yourself about what learning can I take on to really make it a powerful impact. So I also want to share, so as we talked about environmental justice, I wanted to share and highlight some people who are doing the work. So activism within Toronto, and I think it's important to speak to that and to celebrate that. And so here are a few. And as this is a question I also want you to think about before I show that part. So how can integrated and learning about communities and building community-centered approach address the issues of environmental racism? So that's something to take away with you. How can we, when we integrate this, learn about communities, and have a centered approach, how can that tackle environmental racism? So this is Anand, and he works to really help with food security and with communities that need access to food. And I wanted to highlight what he does particularly for Black communities and for the work that he does. So if you're doing this work with students around food sovereignty, he would be somebody to look up. And also the Black Creek Farmers Market, they're doing incredible work and talking about the community and empowering the community and community mobilizing and being advocates. These are people who are doing it. So remember when I said we're not sitting in that space of oppression, but we're moving through and really speaking to what communities doing to help themselves and to take back that narrative. And then I also wanted to share a number of youth who are doing this work, who are environmental activists, and to pay close attention to the diversity And so sometimes we center the same people when we talk about environmental justice. But let's flip that on its head. And let's change the space and provide space for what other people are doing and create space for them. And really shine a spotlight on the meaningful work that other people who look like the students who you are teaching, what they look, what they're doing and how they are making an impact in their communities. So how can you help your students advocate for environmental justice? So that's another question that I really want you to take away and to ponder as well. I see Cynthia has a hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I feel like, especially if you don't have people of color in your class, it's even more important
100.
that you're what you just said. So
Yeah.
it's not just, I mean, it is extremely important for people to see themselves reflected in their classroom, but it's also really important for people to just not constantly look into a mirror.
100%. Thank you so much for sharing that, Cynthia. Absolutely. Was there any questions? Any questions that we have a couple of minutes, and then Stephanie and Alicia are going to talk a little bit about part 2 that hopefully all of you are signed up for. But any questions before they talk a little bit about part 2? Alicia, do you have anything you want to, Aleeya, did you have anything you want to add?
No, I think we are well covered. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to quickly say too that sometimes I think we have to be aware also that sometimes the racism in Canada looks different than other parts in the world. So, you know, we're known to be very polite, but our racism can also be very polite too. And the fact that these situations occur literally, the title of this presentation, in our backyard, is something that we really need to dig deeper to see you know, how we are contributing to these injustices, even currently. So thank you for this information.
That is such a great point, Georgia. Thank you so much.
And even when we think about revitalization, right? Because I'm sure Africville would have been considered a place that they were revitalizing. And so all the forms that revitalization takes up even now, right? And so when we think about Parkdale and Regent Park and areas around Falstaff and the Talk Farm, you know, the different ways that it presents itself now. It's the same sort of thing, just that we're in 2022. And so all the different forms, all the different ways that it still continues to show up. So I'll have Stephanie and Alicia share a little bit about what part 2 will be about. So let me just flip over to that slide.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. So we've got a preliminary survey for you to do, which is going to introduce you to ArcGIS and Survey 123, which in part 2 we are going to explore as a tool, which is a way to center student voice and the student experience in exploring topics and issues that are important to the people that you're working with in your room. So the data that we're collecting are going to inform the topics that we talk about next session. And we will be displaying the data that we collect in the survey, just so that you know. And this example is just going to scratch the surface of the possibilities of what can be done with spatial technology, such as ArcGIS, and a really powerful way to encourage that criticality and to go beyond critical thinking for the students in your room. So I have been for a long time a geography teacher in the TDSB, and I have recently, in 2019, joined TOES, the Outdoor Education Department, and am always thrilled to share my experience and the power of some of these wonderful tools to help support student learning. I'll pass this over now to Aleeya, who's going to talk about ArcGIS.
So my name is Lisa Roberge. I am a teacher at Mark Arnault. And if you go to the next slide, it just shows you the login information. So if you haven't gone onto ArcGIS and you want to follow along with us in the next session, you can just follow the prompts there. So you should be able to automatically log in using your TDSB password and login information. But if not, you just have to reach out to IT if you're part of the TDSB, and you'll be able to gain it that way within like 24 hours. So before the next session, you can try out the different applications we'll be using. These applications we use to understand and to create some transferable skills with our students. So hopefully in the future there'll be, activists, and hopefully in that year that you teach them, they'll be activists as well. So we'll be showing you mapping, Survey 123, and Story Map, how you can use those tools.
Great. Thank you so very much. And I just wanted to thank again our guest speakers, Sylvia and Aleeya. Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about in terms of our impact, intentionally or unintentionally, as you mentioned, when we're speaking to our students, and the importance of layering those resources and building our capacity and centering resistance, empowerment, and resiliency in this. And again, I feel like you said earlier, there should be 3 parts to this. I've learned so much from you, and I can't thank you enough. And I really look forward to our second session with you. So thank you again for joining us. On your screen right now, you'll just be seeing a feedback poll. And if you don't mind just sharing, what were your learning needs? Were they met in this webinar? If you could kindly let us know, that would be fantastic. And just to let you know about some upcoming webinars, we have part 2 of our environmental racism in your backyard on April 4th. The link has been posted in the chat. And tomorrow, Hillary Inwood will be presenting her webinar, Shifting from Climate Anxiety to Climate Action. That sounds really inspiring and optimistic, because hope matters. And hopefully you will be able to join us for that. And we do have some AQ courses so that we'd love for you to think about in April and in June. We've got our ESC courses, parts 1 and 2 being offered in April and again in June. And so we do hope you look out for those. There will be information about that via email. And we do hope that you will be able to join us for upcoming webinars. And if we just go to the next slide, you can keep up with the information if you check out TDSB Eco Schools and OISE's ESE websites for more information. You can find TDSB Eco Schools on Twitter and Instagram. Just search for the handle at Eco Schools TDSB, pardon me. And OISE's ESE initiative can be found at www.utoronto.ca/ESE. And that's about it. If you can please complete the exit poll before you leave, that would be great. And thanks again very much for all of you joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.